If you think HOA drama is just lawn height disputes and mailbox paint codes, wait until you hear how one angry woman shattered a federal vehicle's window because she thought it was blocking her view. And no, she had no idea it belonged to the government until it was too late. Trust me, you will want to stay through the whole story, because what started as a routine site check turned into a full-on meltdown with police, paperwork, and a shattered pane of justice. So hit that like button, subscribe if you love wild true stories, and let us jump into the moment it all began, because I promise, you have never heard anything quite like this. It was around 9:15 in the morning, a regular sunny day, and I had just arrived at the community center of this tightly controlled neighborhood that ran under one of the most overzealous homeowners associations I have ever encountered. I was there on official business, in a clearly marked government vehicle. Big bold letters, federal seal on the side, everything regulation approved. The plan was simple conduct, a quick inspection related to some infrastructure work near the water system easement, file a report, and be out of there in under 40 minutes. I had done this sort of thing dozens of times. Park the car, check the site, move on. But this time, the location was a small cul-de-sac that wrapped around a central garden patch. Quiet, clean, the kind of neighborhood where every driveway was power washed and every blade of grass had a twin. I parked along the curb just beside a bench near the garden. No signs, no red curbs, no restrictions. Just a perfect legal parking space with zero indication that it would soon become ground zero for a suburban disaster. I locked up the vehicle, clipboard in hand, and walked across the street to start my inspection. As I was checking off the first box on my sheet, I heard a sharp click of a door slamming open, followed by the unmistakable sound of angry footsteps. I turned casually, assuming someone might be walking a dog or going for a jog, but what I saw instead was a woman speed-walking toward the government car with the intensity of someone chasing down a thief. Her arms were stiff by her sides, and the expression on her face was the kind that instantly tells you she has been waiting for something to go wrong all morning, just so she could unload all that pent-up HOA fury. She stopped about 2 feet away from the car, planted her hands on her hips, and stared at it like it had just insulted her children. I took a deep breath, walked over, and greeted her politely. "Good morning. Is everything all right?" I asked, still in work mode, still assuming this would be a 5-second interaction. Her response was an instant barrage. "No, everything is not all right. You cannot just park here. You are blocking my entire front view. This is private property. Who do you think you are?" I stayed calm and explained that I was with the federal agency responsible for infrastructure assessments. I even showed her my badge. "This is official business. I will only be here for a short time." I expected a moment of understanding, or at least some acknowledgement that I was not just someone randomly parked there to watch squirrels. But instead, she scoffed and shook her head like I had just made up the whole agency on the spot. "I do not care if you are with the CIA," she said, practically spitting the words. "This is an HOA community. We have rules. You cannot block my view. You need to move. Now, let me be clear. The vehicle was not blocking her driveway. It was not parked in front of her house. It was not obstructing her car, or even parked close to any structure. The only thing it might have been blocking was a few feet of open space she could see from her window space that included a patch of sidewalk and a small tree. I explained again, calmly, that I was on duty and would be leaving shortly. She crossed her arms and muttered something about making a call, then stormed back inside. I thought that would be the end of it. 15 minutes later, I was reviewing data at the side of the retention basin when I heard another voicemail, assertive and also deeply annoyed. I turned to see a man walking toward me, holding a walkie-talkie, wearing a navy polo with the HOA's logo embroidered on the chest. "Excuse me," he said. "I am Greg, the president of this HOA, and we have received a complaint about your vehicle." I was barely surprised at this point, but I stayed professional. I repeated the explanation, showed my badge again, and offered to share the work order documentation. Greg glanced at the papers but clearly had no interest in reading them. "You cannot be here," he said firmly. "We need that space open. Residents have visibility expectations. It is part of our landscaping plan." That was a new one. Visibility expectations. I had heard of noise ordinances, parking restrictions, even mailbox compliance clauses. But apparently, This neighborhood believed they had a right to uninterrupted sightlines across public land. I reiterated that I was operating under federal authority and reminded him that the road I was parked on was under county jurisdiction, not HOA control. That is when Greg's tone shifted from arrogant to confused. He backed off a bit and said he would check with the board, then started muttering into his radio like he was coordinating a search and rescue. Meanwhile, I went back to the inspection site, still expecting that after a bit of grumbling they would let it go. Unbeknownst to me, while Greg was checking in with whatever imaginary council he reported to, Karen had not calmed down. In fact, she had escalated. She had apparently taken it upon herself to solve the problem in the way only a truly entitled person could, by calling more neighbors, fuming on her front lawn, and looking for something that would give her the upper hand. What I did not see while I was busy measuring soil density was that she had been circling the vehicle multiple times, making calls, snapping photos, and working herself into a full-blown frenzy. A storm was building, and I had no idea how quickly it would break. But I would soon find out that when someone like Karen thinks you are defying her sacred HOA Law 7, if you are following actual federal regulations, she does not back down. She strikes. And when she does, the results are not just messy, they are criminal. Greg may have walked off muttering into his little radio like he was calling in a tactical team, but I figured that was the last I would hear from him or from Karen. After all, I had explained everything, showed credentials, was not violating a single rule or law, and had done absolutely nothing that could be considered out of line. I was wrapping up the midpoint of the inspection, noting a couple of surface cracks on the concrete base near a runoff pipe, when I heard what sounded like murmuring behind mellow voices, like people huddled and discussing something from a short distance. I turned my head just enough to catch a glimpse, and sure enough, there was Karen. This time, she had company. A short woman in her 60s wearing a visor and holding a small dog had joined her. A younger man I recognized from one of the nearby houses was also there, arms crossed and watching me with a level of suspicion usually reserved for shoplifters. They were not saying much, but they were clearly talking about me and the vehicle. From the way they stood, it was obvious Karen had been spinning some elaborate tale and rallying support for her one-woman HOA crusade. I ignored it. I had work to finish and a tight schedule. What I did not know at the time was that Karen had not only recruited some neighbors, she had also gone back into her house and dug around for what I can only describe as her own personal evidence kit, a stack of HOA violation forms, a thick folder filled with community bylaws, and most notably a handheld camcorder. Not a phone, not a tablet, but an actual camcorder, the kind people used in the early 2000s. She began filming the car from multiple angles, dramatically zooming in on the license plate, the agency decals, even the wheels. I overheard snippets like, unregistered, probably fake, and, this is going to the board. I was half amused, half irritated, and all too aware of how derailed this morning was becoming. Just when I was about to pack up and head back to the vehicle, I saw Greg returning. This time, he was flanked by yet another resident and holding a binder of his own. It was absurd, like they were preparing to present a case to the Supreme Court. Greg started again, this time trying to sound more official. I have here the HOA parking guidelines, he said. According to Section 4.3, extended vehicle parking is only permitted in designated zones. I pointed to the curb, completely devoid of signage or paint, and said calmly, I have not exceeded 35 minutes. I am still within federal work scope, and this street is under county jurisdiction, not your HOA. Greg flipped through his binder like he was searching for a rebuttal, but he had nothing. Still, Karen was not done. She marched up and, with all the indignation of a soap opera villain, demanded that I move the car immediately or face the consequences. That phrase stood out to me. Consequences. Like this was some kind of turf war. I told her firmly that I would be departing shortly and that any further interference would be documented and reported. Karen's face twisted into a mixture of disbelief and rage. She turned and stomped back toward her house, muttering something that sounded a lot like, then I will take care of it myself. And that is when things really took a turn. As I wrapped up the final part of the inspection, I noticed the crowd around my car had grown. A few more neighbors had gathered, standing on their porches or sidewalks, watching the drama unfold like it was the main event in a reality television series. Some were just curious, Others were clearly on Karen's side. I even overheard someone say, "That is the guy she was yelling about yesterday," which made it obvious that Karen had been worked up long before I ever parked my vehicle there. I had just unknowingly become the target of her ongoing war against anything she considered out of place or beyond her control. The timing, the location, the federal insignia on the door, it all became her trigger. When I made it back to the vehicle, I noticed immediately that something was off. There were fresh scuff marks along the side mirror, and what looked like fingerprints on the driver's side window, greasy, smeared, like someone had been leaning in and trying to peer inside. That was enough for me to take out my phone and start documenting. I took pictures of everything, including the growing crowd and the gathering tension in the air. I called my supervisor to report a possible interference incident, just to get it on the record. Then, just as I was finishing the call, I heard the distinct sound of gravel crunching under a sudden, determined footstep. I turned and saw Karen, storming out of her house like she had made a final decision she was completely committed to. She had a brick in her hand. Not a rock, a full-sized red clay brick, the kind used for patio borders or decorative garden beds. She walked straight up to the car, held it up at shoulder height, and for a moment, everything slowed down. People gasped. A woman holding a baby stroller pulled back in horror. Someone shouted, "Karen, what are you doing?" But she was beyond reason. With a scream that sounded more like a declaration of war than a cry of frustration, she hurled the brick at the passenger side window. The explosion of sound as glass shattered rang through the entire cul-de-sac. It was not a crack, it was an obliteration. The window imploded inward, shards flying across the seats and dashboard, the remaining edges jagged like broken teeth. The crowd stood in stunned silence. Karen, panting and flushed, looked around as if expecting a round of applause. Instead, people backed away. One of her own supporters muttered, "I told you to calm down." Another simply walked off, shaking his head. I could not believe what I had just witnessed. I had just watched a woman smash the window of a federal vehicle, in broad daylight, in front of multiple witnesses, because she did not like where it was parked. I walked slowly toward her, keeping my voice even. "You just vandalized a federal property," I said. "This is a government vehicle. You just committed a federal offense." Karen blinked. "Wait," she said, her voice faltering. "Government? Like official government? I thought..." And just like that, her anger turned to fear. Her jaw hung open, eyes wide, realizing for the first time that her little temper tantrum had just graduated into an actual crime. She started stammering. "I thought it was a contractor or something. I did not know it. Looked, there was no siren or anything." I pointed directly at the federal seal on the door, which had been visible the entire time. "You mean this? The one that says Department of Infrastructure Services? The one I showed you when I arrived?" Karen just stood there, frozen. Her hand still clutched part of her skirt, as though holding onto it would somehow undo what she had just done. And then came the sirens. Someone had called the police, probably one of the neighbors watching in disbelief, and now the faint wail of a cruiser echoed from the far end of the neighborhood. Karen started pacing in tight circles, whispering, "Oh no, oh no, oh no," as though saying it repeatedly would make it less true. The neighbors who had filmed everything were already uploading clips to their neighborhood chat and probably beyond. One woman said, "You are going viral, Karen," without a trace of humor in her voice. Karen finally sat down on the grass, hands in her lap, eyes darting around like she was searching for a way out. But there was no way out. The brick lay where it had landed, the damage already done, the federal agency already informed, and the law already on its way. And all of it every second, because she could not stand the idea of her view being blocked. There was a strange stillness that settled over the street right after the brick hit. For a full 5 seconds, no one moved. It was as if every sound in the world just paused. No dogs barking, no footsteps, not even the breeze through the trees. Just the slow realization sinking into everyone's faces that what they had witnessed was no longer neighborhood drama. It was something serious now. Karen stood frozen, the smugness drained from her expression like ink fading off a page. You could see the moment it clicked in her eyes that she had done something irreversible. She glanced around, hoping someone might back her up, justify her outburst, or claim that maybe she had a good reason to do what she did. but no one spoke. Even the woman with the little white dog, who had stood by Karen like a backup singer earlier, now kept her head low and began slowly walking away. Then came the whispering. People huddled in twos and threes, murmuring things like, "Did you see that?" And, "She actually did it." One guy even said, "She has finally lost it," as he shook his head and pulled out his phone, no doubt dialing someone to relay the news before it hit the neighborhood group chat. Karen turned her attention to me again, her posture suddenly differentless, aggressive, more defensive, like a student who realized they had filled in all the wrong bubbles on an exam. "Okay, but you do not understand," she began, her voice shaking. "You were parked here for over 30 minutes. You cannot just leave your car anywhere. I thought you were faking it. I did not know you were actually with the government." That was when the absurdity of the moment hit its peak. I pointed directly at the shattered passenger window, and then to the large decal that had been displayed on the vehicle's door the entire time. "You mean this? The agency badge that is literally bigger than your dog? The badge I showed you when I arrived? The one you ignored while demanding I move for your precious view of a sidewalk?" She stammered something incoherent, her face flushing deep red as the weight of what she had done became too heavy to deny. Just as I was about to say something else, the sound of tires crunching over asphalt broke the silence. 2 police cruisers rolled around the bend of the cul-de-sac and came to a stop just past the vehicle. Doors opened. Officers stepped out. One of them, tall and calm with a clipboard already in hand, surveyed the scene like he had walked into a situation he had seen far too many times before. The officer approached me first, asked for a quick rundown. I gave him the basics: who I was, what my agency was doing, how long I had been there, and what had just occurred. I showed him my credentials, the inspection orders, and the photos I had taken of the car before and after the damage. He nodded, jotting down notes. Then he turned to Karen. Her posture instantly shifted again. She clasped her hands in front of her, tilted her head slightly, and adopted the tone of someone who was trying to come across as the real victim. "Officer, I was just trying to protect my community," she began, her voice now laced with theatrical trembles. "This man left a vehicle unattended for an unreasonable amount of time. I thought it might be dangerous. I had no idea it was federal. There were no flashing lights or anything. I felt threatened." The officer let her finish her dramatic monologue, then turned to her and asked a single question. "Did you throw the brick?" Karen's mouth opened slightly. I reacted. I was upset. "I did not mean—" He cut her off. "Ma'am, that was a yes or no question. Did you throw the brick?" She hesitated. Her eyes darted to the brick, still sitting on the pavement like a smoking gun. "Yes," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I—" "Okay," the officer said, flipping to a new page on his clipboard. "That is destruction of government property. That is a federal offense. You are aware of that, correct?" The look on Karen's face in that moment was hard to describe. It was not just shock, it was the realization that her need to control her neighborhood narrative had finally crossed a line that could not be rewritten with a complaint letter. She began breathing heavily, muttering that she had not known, that she would never have done it if she had been properly informed, and that she thought I was some kind of contractor, but no one was buying it anymore. While the officers questioned Karen further, a second vehicle rolled up. This one did not belong to local law enforcement. It belonged to the agency I was working with. Out stepped one of our field coordinators, an experienced agent named Rothman, who had seen his fair share of ridiculous situations in the line of duty, but even he raised his eyebrows when he took in the scene before him. Rothman walked over to assess the damage, looked at the shattered window, then at Karen, and then at me. "You all right?" he asked. I nodded. "Good," he said, "because this is going to be paperwork hell." He then joined the officers, presented his credentials, and began explaining the legal framework surrounding the vehicle and the implications of what had just taken place. Karen was now visibly sweating, her bravado stripped down to pure panic. "Can we just handle this internally?" she asked at one point. "I mean, do we really need to get everyone involved?" One of the officers replied without missing a beat. "Ma'am, you already got everyone involved the moment you decided to hurl a brick at a government asset. There is no internal solution for that." Karen looked around again, desperate for support, but the neighbors had either dispersed or retreated into awkward silence. Even Greg had vanished from view. There was no one left to defend her. The reality was crashing down, hard and fast. And still, she tried one last time to justify her actions, insisting that the presence of the vehicle had caused her anxiety, that she felt unsafe seeing something unfamiliar parked in her view, that she just snapped because she thought nobody would do anything about it. Rothman interrupted her and said, "You do not get to vandalize federal property because you are having a stressful morning. That is not how this works." The officers began completing their initial incident report, marking Karen down for destruction of government property, pending further charges based on federal jurisdiction. Karen was not arrested on the spot, but she was issued a formal citation and notified that she would be contacted for further questioning. The officers also took statements from several witnesses, including the woman with the stroller and the young man who had initially stood with Karen but had since turned away, clearly shaken by how far things had gone. When it was finally over and the area began to clear out, I stood by the vehicle and looked at what was left of the window. Glass dust coated the passenger seat. Shards were still embedded in the doorframe. The clipboard I had left inside was now speckled with tiny fractures, the paperwork warped by the force of the impact. Rothman shook his head and said, "You cannot make this stuff up." He was right. Because no matter how many times I had dealt with difficult communities or fielded complaints from entitled residents, nothing had ever escalated this far, this fast, or with this level of absolute lunacy. The kicker? As the officers prepared to leave, Karen turned to one of them and asked, with a desperate, cracking voice, "This is not going to be on the news, is it?" He looked at her and said, "That depends. Are you planning to throw another brick at someone's windshield?" She looked down and said nothing. That was the moment it fully sank in for her. Not just that she had broken a law, not just that she had destroyed something she had no right to touch, but that she had become exactly what she feared, most out of control, publicly shamed, and with absolutely no one left on her side. And as I stood there looking at the damage, I realized this was never about parking. It was never about visibility or bylaws. It was about control. About someone so obsessed with order and her version of right and wrong that she thought she was entitled to take matters into her own hands. She thought she could intimidate, escalate, and dominate, and that no one would stop her. But this time, someone did, and that someone was the law. As the police wrapped up their preliminary investigation and Rothman began photographing the damage for our internal report, it seemed like the neighborhood was returning to its usual calm. The street cleared out little by little, most of the spectators having seen more drama than they had bargained for on a weekday morning. But just when it felt like the tension had peaked and finally begun to subside, Greg re-emerged. He came jogging back toward the scene from the opposite end of the street, slightly out of breath, holding a white folder and with that familiar look of forced professionalism stretched across his face. It was the same expression he wore earlier when trying to quote bylaws that held no weight outside of community landscaping disputes, only now it had a slightly panicked edge to it, like he was trying to find a way to undo what had just happened by introducing one last act of damage control. He walked directly up to Rothman, and the lead officer cleared his throat and began speaking as if he were offering a perfectly logical resolution to a minor misunderstanding. "Listen, officers, I think we can all agree that what happened here today was unfortunate, but perhaps not as severe as it looks. Emotions ran high, that much is clear, but maybe we can explore ways to settle this among the community. No need to involve courts or escalate the situation further." He smiled thinly and glanced at Karen, who was now sitting on the curb with her head down, arms wrapped around herself like she was bracing for a storm that had already passed. Rothman just stared at Greg, unimpressed. The lead officer, without even pausing to look up from his notepad, replied flatly, "Sir, your resident just threw a brick through the window of a government vehicle. That is not something handled with a neighborhood potluck and a group apology. This is no longer an internal HOA matter." Greg pressed on, undeterred by the clear lack of interest. "But surely there is some kind of restitution option. Maybe Karen can pay for the damages, and we can write a letter of apology on behalf of the association. I think we can all agree this has been blown out of proportion." Rothman finally spoke up, cutting through Greg's diplomatic tone with clear, sharp finality. "No, we cannot agree to that. Your resident committed a federal crime. There is no community resolution to federal vandalism. This is going to court, and there will be a formal investigation." The department does not negotiate with neighborhood associations trying to shield someone from accountability. That was when Greg's tone shifted. He stepped back slightly and raised his hands in that defensive, "I tried my best" gesture, like someone walking away from a fire he had secretly helped ignite. "Understood," he said quickly. "I just wanted to make the offer. We, as an HOA, do not condone any form of violence or property destruction." This was all very unexpected. Rothman raised an eyebrow and replied, "It is funny you say that now, but your board member was informed this was a federal inspection when we arrived. Your community member was shown credentials, twice. What is unexpected is that none of you stopped her when she went for the brick." Greg nodded silently, lips pressed tightly together, then turned and walked off without saying another word. For someone who had tried so hard to play the part of the neighborhood authority, he sure folded fast when actual authority showed up. Later that afternoon, as I waited for the vehicle to be towed and replaced with a backup unit, I was contacted by our agency's legal team to file a more detailed incident report. That was when I found out something even more interesting. Karen had a documented history with the HOA. Apparently, over the past 3 years, there had been more than a dozen formal complaints lodged against her by other residents. Some were for minor disputes, like threatening to fine a neighbor for having wind chimes that were too loud on breezy days. Others were more serious, accusing her of verbal harassment, stalking delivery drivers with her phone camera, and even trying to physically remove Halloween decorations she did not approve of because she believed they invited demonic energy. One case stood out more than the rest. A local pizza shop had filed a complaint after Karen followed their driver through the community, flagged him down while he was mid-delivery, and accused him of unauthorized pepperoni access. She claimed he had violated dietary restrictions she believed applied to the entire neighborhood because of an obscure health newsletter she helped write. The board had apparently reviewed that incident and dismissed it as eccentric behavior, but a few residents had warned that if someone like Karen was not reined in, something worse could happen. They were right. Once word of the brick incident spread through the community, the neighborhood's private online forum lit up like wildfire. People who had been silent until then began posting their own stories. One woman claimed that Karen once threatened to report her for unauthorized sunbathing because she wore a bikini in her backyard. Another person said Karen regularly walked around at night, writing down license plate numbers, and had been known to call the tow company on visitors if they parked more than 3 inches from the curb. One man simply wrote, "She has always acted like the sheriff of suburbia. Looks like she finally arrested herself." What had been a quiet, passive-aggressive culture of whispers and avoidance suddenly turned into a full-blown airing of grievances, and Karen was no longer the feared enforcer of HOA expectations. She was the neighborhood pariah. Greg issued a formal email that evening, stating that the HOA did not support Karen's actions and that she would be temporarily relieved of all volunteer duties pending investigation. But nobody missed the fact that he did not apologize for enabling her behavior in the first place. He ended the statement by saying, "We remain committed to ensuring our community reflects shared values of respect and civility," which probably sounded nice to someone who had not seen Greg try to defend brick throwing as a visibility dispute just hours earlier. The next day, someone uploaded a full compilation video of the incident using neighborhood footage and eyewitness accounts. It had everything: the brick throw, the sirens, Karen pacing in panic, and Greg awkwardly trying to de-escalate after the damage was already done. By the end of the week, the video had reached beyond the community chat and was making its way onto larger social media platforms. One clip alone got thousands of shares, captioned simply, "When HOA Karen meets federal consequences." Memes followed. My personal favorite was a side-by-side image on the left, Karen holding her camcorder, and on the right, the shattered glass, with the text, "She wanted evidence." She became the evidence. People who had never spoken up suddenly found their voices. Neighbors who had lived in fear of Karen's complaints or surprise visits were finally laughing at her instead of looking over their shoulders. Even those who had remained neutral now admitted that what happened was not surprising. It had been building up for years. As for Karen, she went quiet. She stopped posting in the forums, closed her blinds, and reportedly cancelled all her HOA meetings indefinitely. A for sale sign went up in her front yard 3 days later, though no one knows whether she listed the house herself or if it was encouraged by someone with legal foresight. Either way, the Queen of Community Order had fallen from her throne. The clipboard, the visor, the rulebook all rendered useless by a single, reckless moment. One neighbor summed it up best in a comment under the video compilation. She threw a brick at the wrong problem. Turns out, the real issue was not the view. It was her reflection. The aftermath of what happened did not just ripple through the quiet lanes of that neighborhood, it detonated across it like a shockwave. The day after Karen's infamous brick-throwing meltdown, the HOA message board hit its post limit by noon. Residents who had never made more than a comment or two in years were suddenly writing full essays. Some were shocked, some were not surprised at all, and some had clearly been waiting for the moment when the rest of the community would finally see what they had seen all along. A thread titled, "Karen, the Final Straw," exploded with activity. It began with someone posting a simple sentence. "She finally did it. I knew she would." That was all it took. A torrent of screenshots, old stories, grievances, passive-aggressive letters, and petty violations she had handed out over the years came flooding in from every corner of the cul-de-sac. One woman recounted how Karen had once handed her a formal violation for hanging a beach towel over her backyard fence. It violated the sightline aesthetic of the shared green space, she quoted from the note. Another man said Karen had taken it upon herself to log the arrival and departure times of his teenage son's car and emailed the log to the entire HOA board, claiming that the kid was running some sort of unauthorized late-night delivery scheme. Turned out, the boy was just working part-time at a fast food restaurant and happened to be using the driveway after curfew. Hours, nothing illegal, nothing even unusual, but Karen had treated it like a cartel operation. A military veteran who lived 2 houses down shared that he had once decorated his porch with small flags during Memorial Day weekend and received a hand-delivered citation for excessive political imagery. Several parents shared stories of Karen following their children on bikes, warning them they were disturbing the balance of pedestrian zones. None of these stories surprised me after what I had seen, but the sheer volume of them was staggering. This was not a case of one woman having a bad day or being caught in an uncharacteristic moment of rage. This was a pattern, a years-long pattern of someone who had taken the idea of community standards and weaponized them into a personal fiefdom. She was not enforcing rules for the sake of safety or order, she was policing the neighborhood to control it, and now that the spotlight was on her, there was nowhere to hide. The reactions ranged from disbelief to outright celebration. "Justice for the pizza guy" became a running joke in multiple threads. Someone even changed their username to "Unregistered Wind Chime." One of the more poetic neighbors wrote a 3-stanza haiku about the sound of the brick shattering glass and titled it "Zen of Consequence." What had been a culture of silence had suddenly turned into an eruption of long-suppressed frustration, all aimed directly at the same person. Even those who had previously backed Karen started scrambling to distance themselves. A man named Robert, who had co-signed one of her letters last year demanding the removal of aggressively colored holiday lights, posted a statement saying he regretted his involvement and that he had only wanted to keep the neighborhood harmonious. Others who had served with her on the HOA volunteer committees remained noticeably quiet, either not logging in at all or pretending as if they had never even heard of her. But perhaps the most telling move came from Greg himself. Less than 48 hours after the incident, an update appeared on the official HOA site. Greg had stepped down. The announcement was written in the kind of vague, carefully sanitized language typical of someone trying to escape liability. It said he was resigning to prioritize personal obligations and that his time serving the community had been a meaningful chapter. No mention of the federal investigation, no mention of Karen, not even a nod to the fact that his last official act had been attempting to smooth over a federal crime with an apology folder. But everybody knew. The timing said it all. What made Greg's resignation even more awkward was that Karen's name had already become a kind of cultural warning label in the community. It was no longer about one person. "Do not go full Karen," someone wrote under a thread about lawn decor. "Let us not turn into Karenville," said another under a post debating the color of neighborhood mailboxes. Her behavior had been so excessive, so over the top, that it had become the new metric for unacceptable. Parents were using her story as a teachable moment for their kids. See what happens when you do not listen and throw things? The jokes were non-stop, but behind the laughter was something deeper relief. People were relieved that the spell had finally broken. That they could decorate their yards, let their kids ride bikes, walk their dogs without fear of being watched, judged, or reported. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like it was breathing again. And Karen? She vanished. Not literally, her house was still there, but she was nowhere to be seen. The windows stayed shuttered. The porch light, once always on as if she were monitoring the street 24 hours a day, stayed off. A few neighbors claimed they saw her drive out early one morning, but no one could confirm where she went. The community watched as, quietly and without fanfare, a real estate sign appeared in her front lawn. At first people thought it was fake, just some neighbor's elaborate joke, but it was real, a legitimate listing. No open house, no flyers. Just a generic online listing with no photos of the interior and an unusually urgent price drop. She was leaving. Whether by choice or because of legal pressure, no one knew, but everyone agreed it was overdue. Her departure did not erase the damage, but it did send a message. You could be the loudest voice in the room, the most feared clipboard in the cul-de-sac, but once you crossed the line from petty enforcement to criminal action, the system would not protect you. Your influence vanished the moment you were exposed. No title, no board seat, no archived violation form would shield you from accountability. And while Karen's name might have once carried weight in that neighborhood, it now carried nothing but infamy. As for me, the vehicle was repaired and returned to service a couple of weeks later. The agency handled all the internal processing and legal escalation without needing much more from me. But what stayed with me was not the paperwork. It was the story. The surreal memory of standing in a quiet, pristine cul-de-sac, watching a woman destroy a government vehicle because she thought her view mattered more than the law. It reminded me that entitlement does not need a reason to explode. Sometimes, all it needs is an audience and a lack of consequence. Until one day, the consequence shows up in uniform with a clipboard of its own. I still drive past neighborhoods like that sometimes. Clean lawns, garden flags, trimmed hedges. From the outside, they look perfect, but now I know better. Perfection is often just pressure in disguise, and if you push hard enough, sometimes it pushes back. Or, in Karen's case, sometimes it throws a brick and finds out the hard way that the world does not revolve around her living room view.